Mail-order bride was left to die until the lonely Comanche rode up and said, "Coming home with me." Coldwater, Wyoming, winter 1876. Snow drifted in thick, lazy spirals from a sky the color of gunmetal. The wind screamed through the gaps in the boarded windows, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and whiskey from the saloon across the street. The piano there banged out a jaunty tune that could not quite hide the arguments and muffled curses behind its doors. At the edge of the platform, where the train's steam still clung to the air, a lone woman stood. Sarah Ellis clutched a scuffed brown valise to her chest. Her wool cloak was worn thin, and the hood barely kept the icy air from needling her cheeks. She shifted her weight from one frozen boot to the other, eyes scanning the street for a familiar face. One that would not come. She stepped up to the station master's window. "Sir, has Thomas Carson come for me?" Her voice was steady, though her fingers tightened on the handle of her bag. The station master, a man with a sagging mustache and eyes that couldn't hold her gaze, hesitated. "He died last week in a stagecoach robbery." His tone was flat, as though reading from a weather report. The words struck harder than the wind. Sarah blinked, her lips parting, but no sound came out. Behind her, boots thudded on the platform. Laughter, low, jeering, rose from a group of men spilling out of the saloon, their steps unsteady, breath hot with liquor. "Looks like the mail-order package finally arrived," one called out, his grin missing teeth. Another leaned against a post, eyes roving over her. "Mail-order trash," he spat into the snow. Sarah's stomach knotted. She stepped back toward the shadows by the baggage cart, wishing for the sound of her brother's voice, the one that had always made her feel safe. The wind shifted. Hoofbeats, steady, unhurried, echoed down the street. Out of the curtain of snow emerged a tall man astride a black horse. His hair was bound with a strip of leather, his shoulders broad beneath a worn buckskin coat. His eyes, sharp and dark, swept over the scene. The drunks fell silent under that gaze. The tallest of them took a step back, muttering something to the others. Without a word, they turned and slouched away, toward the saloon's dim light. The rider dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. He stood in front of Sarah, close enough for her to see the faint scar along his jaw. "You'll die out here," he said, his voice low but certain. "Come with me." Sarah hesitated. His skin, his braids, the beads along his coat marked him as Comanche. She had heard the stories, the warnings whispered back east. But in his eyes, steady, unflinching, she saw something achingly familiar, a shadow of her brother's protectiveness. The wind gusted hard enough to shove her a step toward him. He shrugged off his coat, a heavy, fur-lined garment, and draped it over her shoulders. For the cold. She looked down at the fabric, then back up at him. Slowly she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, faded handkerchief. She tied it carefully around the handle of her valise. "For my brother," she murmured, more to herself than to him. His lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile. He led his horse closer, offering his hand. Sarah took it. The warmth of his grip surprised her. She swung up into the saddle, feeling the leather creak under her weight. He mounted behind her, one arm resting loosely near her side, not touching, yet shielding her from the wind. The horse stepped forward, hooves muffled in the snow. The saloon's piano faded behind them, swallowed by the sound of the wind and the soft snort of the animal. Moonlight broke through the clouds, painting the white plain in silver. For the first time since stepping off the train, Sarah felt the faintest ember of safety. They rode into the night, leaving Coldwater's lamplight far behind. The Comanche village, later that night. The black horse carried them across the frozen plain until shapes began to form through the flurries. Low, rounded lodges of hide, their surfaces dusted white, smoke curling from the holes at their peaks. Firelight flickered against the snow, glowing like embers scattered across the darkness. They entered the circle of the village, the wind dropping to a low moan as it passed behind the ridge. People emerged from the lodges, men in thick buffalo robes, women with braids draped over their shoulders, children peering from behind their mothers' skirts. Whispers rose almost instantly. White woman brings bad luck, an older voice muttered. Another shook her head, eyes narrowed. She should not be here. At the center of the gathering stood Maka, the village elder. His face was deeply lined, his dark eyes like flint. He did not raise his voice, yet the weight of his presence quieted those around him. He studied Sarah for a long moment, saying nothing, before turning to Chaitin. A sharp exchange in Comanche passed between them, words Sarah could not understand, but the tone was unmistakable, disapproval. Chaitin did not argue. He simply led the horse toward the far edge of the camp, where the glow of the central fires dimmed. There, a small, empty lodge waited, its flap tied closed. He dismounted and held out a hand to help her down. "You can stay here," he said. He stepped inside and found a small bedroll laid out near a stone fire ring. The hide walls muffled the wind, but the cold clung to the air. Before she could speak, Chaitin disappeared, returning moments later with a small wooden plate holding a piece of warm cornbread. "For you," he said simply, setting it on a low stool near her. Sarah sat, pulling the bread into small bites. She glanced down at her dress, a once serviceable gray wool now torn at the hem, with seams straining from weeks of travel. Her fingers found the small sewing kit in her valise. She bent over her lap, working in the dim light from the crackling fire pit. Every few minutes her eyes flicked toward the shadow at the lodge entrance. Outside, Chaitin was tending to his horse, running a cloth along its flank, checking the hooves. But his gaze often strayed toward the small lodge. When she set down the bread, she hesitated, then broke off a piece and placed it on the stool by the door flap. "For your kindness," she whispered to the empty space. Later, as the fires in the village began to die down, Sarah heard voices outside. Maka's low, gravelly tone drifted through the hide walls. "She will bring trouble. The white world always does." "She is alone," Chaitin answered, voice calm but firm. "The snow will kill her." "You put us at risk," Maka said. "Remember your sister." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant crackle of a fire. Sarah's hands stilled on her sewing. She pressed her lips together, a knot tightening in her chest. She wanted to believe she would not be turned out into the cold. But the elder's words dug deep. Minutes later, a soft sound reached her ears, the faint crunch of snow under boots. She lifted the lodge flap just enough to see a tall shadow standing just beyond the entrance. Chaitin, his arms folded, gaze scanning the darkness beyond the village. He did not look at her. He did not need to. His presence alone, steady and silent, sent warmth through the cold. She let the flap fall closed and lay down on the bedroll, the small piece of cornbread still on the stool, untouched. Outside, the wind rose again, but it no longer sounded quite as harsh. By morning, the village was stirring, smoke curling upward from the center fires. Sarah stepped from her lodge, the cold air nipping at her cheeks, and watched the women kneel by the flames, coaxing sparks into steady heat. One of them handed her a bundle of kindling and motioned to the circle. She crouched down, awkward at first, mimicking the careful stacking of twigs and chips. When her fire caught, a thin ribbon of smoke rising into the pale sky, she felt a small swell of pride. That moment was cut short by a familiar voice. Maka stood a few paces away, arms crossed, eyes hard. "White sickness comes from white hands," he said in English, his accent sharp. "Do not bring it here." Sarah froze, unsure how to respond, but before the silence could stretch too long, Chaitin appeared beside her. Without a word to the elder, he took a length of rope from his belt and nodded toward the tethered horses. She followed him, relief quiet but tangible. He showed her how to loop the rope around the post, how to knot it so it would hold even if the horse pulled back. His hands moved with deliberate precision, and when she tried, her fingers clumsy in the cold, his larger ones brushed hers to guide the twist. She looked up, just for a second, and found his gaze already on her. That evening, the hunters returned with news that made the air in the village grow taut. A blade, its hilt marked by a rough engraving, had been found in the snow near the ridge. Chaitin's expression darkened when he examined it. He said nothing to her, but the set of his jaw told her enough. There were men out there, and they were too close. When darkness fell, the villagers gathered near the central fire. Chaitin sat to one side, carving something into a wooden post with his knife. Sarah, sitting a few feet away, began to hum, a melody from far to the east, a lullaby her mother used to sing. The words came softly at first, then with more certainty. Chaitin glanced up. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, echoing the tune, as though some part of it was not entirely foreign. For a moment they shared the same quiet rhythm, the fire painting their faces in gold and shadow. When she rose to return to her lodge, she found the post beside her door now bore a small carved star. He stood there, still holding the knife. "For your dreams," he said simply, before walking away. Later, she took the handkerchief she had kept tucked in her valise, the one with the faint blue embroidery, and set it on the low stool by his tent flap. "For your hands," she whispered to the still night. Near the end of the evening, he came to the fire carrying a small loaf of bread. Without ceremony, he broke it and held half out to her. She hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. It was the first time she had touched him without fear. The warmth from his skin lingered even as wolves began to howl far out on the plain, their voices threading through the fire's crackle. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The warning came on a day when the sky was low and gray, the wind carrying more than just the bite of snow. A trader from a neighboring settlement arrived with news. A band of outlaws, men known for robbing stagecoaches and burning ranches, had been spotted moving north. They were said to be drinking in the Coldwater Saloon just 2 nights ago, bragging about taking Comanche horses for themselves. The mood in the village shifted. Men tightened the lashings on their lodges, checked the edges of their blades. Women drew children closer. Sarah heard the low conversations, caught words like ridge and patrol. She watched Chaitin strap on his knife and bow, his movements purposeful, silent. When he rode out with 2 other men, Sarah found herself lingering at the edge of the village, watching until the shapes of the horses dissolved into the snow. He returned at dusk, his steps slower than usual. Snow clung to his coat, and a dark stain spread along his sleeve. Sarah saw him pause near his tent, flexing his arm as though to shake off pain. Before he could retreat inside, she approached, holding a strip of clean cloth she'd taken from her meager belongings. "Let me see," she said quietly. "It's nothing," he replied, but she caught the tightening around his mouth. She reached for his sleeve before she could think better of it. The fabric was stiff with half-frozen blood. Beneath it, a shallow cut ran along his forearm. "From the ridge?" she asked. He didn't answer, just watched her as she wrapped the cloth around the wound, tying it snugly. Her fingers brushed his skin, warm despite the cold, and for an instant she saw a flicker in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at being tended to. That night, the attack came earlier than anyone expected. The first shouts rose from the northern edge of the camp, followed by the pounding of hooves and the wild whoops of men charging. Snow sprayed up in arcs under the horses' feet, and firelight flashed off metal. Sarah was still by the central fire when a rough hand seized her arm. A man with a filthy beard and a reek of whiskey yanked her toward the edge of the village, using her as a shield as other outlaws dismounted, shouting orders. "One wrong move and she burns with you," he bellowed toward the nearest Comanche warrior. Her heart slammed in her chest, but somewhere under the terror was something else. An urge not to be the weakness that brought them harm. Her gaze darted to a hanging oil lantern swaying from a wooden post near the lodge. She wrenched her arm hard enough to make her captor stumble a step and snatched the lantern. The man cursed, lunging for her, but she hurled the lantern to the ground at his feet. It shattered, flames licking up instantly as the oil spilled into the snow. Thick black smoke rolled upward, carried by the wind toward the rest of the camp. It was enough. Warriors burst from behind lodges, arrows nocked, blades drawn. The outlaws faltered, coughing in the smoke. Through the chaos, Chaitin appeared, moving low and fast, his knife flashing. He reached her side, shoving her behind him. For a moment the world narrowed to the sound of his breathing and the hiss of fire. When the last of the bandits broke and fled into the night, the snow was trampled and sooted, the smell of burned oil sharp in the air. Chayton turned to her, his expression unreadable, then reached into his belt. He held out a small blade, the handle wrapped in worn leather. "For your strength," he said. Her fingers closed around it, feeling the weight. It was not just a weapon, it was trust. Later, as the village gathered to assess the damage, she noticed a tear in his coat. The stitching ripped from where he'd fought. Without asking, she fetched her needle and thread, kneeling beside him in the snow. "For your fight," she said softly, as she drew the needle through the fabric. He watched her hands, his gaze steady but quieter than usual, as though words might break something fragile between them. When the last seam was tied, the cold seemed to rush back in. He stood, scanning the ridges for any sign of return, and then his eyes met hers. No thanks passed his lips. Yet in the charged stillness between them, in the drifting smoke, the muffled shouts of the villagers, and the faint whistle of the wind, she heard it all the same. The night after the attack, the air was brittle with cold, the snow reflecting the orange light of scattered fires still burning low from overturned oil lamps. The outlaws had scattered, but one figure remained, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a sneer that curled at the edges of his cracked lips. He stood in the center of the village, a pistol at his hip, eyes fixed on Sarah as though marking her for later. Chayton stepped forward from the line of warriors. No words passed between him and the man, but the challenge was unmistakable. The outlaw reached for his gun, yet Chayton moved first, knocking the weapon into the snow with a sweep of his arm. The two closed in, their boots churning the frozen ground, the sounds of their struggle sharp in the still night. The outlaw swung hard, but Chayton caught his wrist, twisting until the man dropped to one knee. Sarah watched, heart pounding, torn between fear and the strange calm that came from knowing Chayton was there. He moved with precision, every strike controlled, as though his strength was something he carried, not something he had to prove. When the outlaw finally lay in the snow, breath ragged, Chayton knelt beside him. From the pouch at his belt he took a strip of cloth and wrapped it around the man's bleeding hand. "Leave," he said, his voice low, each word edged with steel. "Don't return." The man's eyes flicked to Sarah once before he staggered away, disappearing into the dark beyond the ridge. Around them, the village stirred into motion. Flames licked the edges of one of the smaller lodges, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a bucket from the snowbank, scooped icy water, and dashed it over the fire. Another bucket came her way from a young boy, and she worked in rhythm with the others, stamping out embers, beating sparks from the hide walls. Her hands stung from the cold, but she remembered what Chayton had shown her about the way snow could be packed to smother a flame. She dropped to her knees, shoveling drifts into the base of the fire until the smoke thinned to nothing. When it was done, she straightened, breathing hard. Across the firelit clearing, she saw Maka watching her. His expression had shifted. Not acceptance, but something closer to consideration. Still, his eyes held a reserve that told her trust would not come easily. Later, when the village had quieted and most had retreated to their lodges, Sarah returned to her own. By the entrance, nestled in the snow, lay a small bundle of wildflowers, white and purple, their petals fragile against the cold. She crouched and touched them, surprised they had survived the frost. "For your courage," Chayton said from behind her. His voice was almost lost in the whisper of the wind. She turned, the flowers cradled in her hands. "And for your heart," she replied softly. From the belt of her dress, she pulled a thin strip of leather she had been saving, worn smooth from her fingers. She stepped close and tied it gently around his neck, letting it rest against the beaded collar of his coat. He looked down at the leather, then back at her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. The moon climbed higher, casting silver over the snow. They stood in the quiet, the village breathing softly around them. For a moment, it felt as though the night had folded in, leaving just the two of them. Her hand found his without thought. His fingers closed over hers, warm and steady. The fight, the cold, the tension of the day, all of it softened in that single contact. She did not know if this meant she would stay, or if the world beyond the ridge would still try to pull her away, but in that moment, he was the one fixed point she could trust. Chayton held her gaze, the moonlight catching in his eyes. No promises were spoken, no vows exchanged, yet the space between them felt bound by something stronger than either could name. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of wood smoke and snow. She tightened her hold on his hand, and he did the same, until it felt less like an instinct and more like a choice. The first sign of strangers came with the clatter of wagon wheels on frozen ground. The village stirred, wary eyes turning toward the figures emerging through the drifted snow. A finely dressed man and woman, their coats trimmed with fur, their boots spotless despite the road behind them. A driver remained by the team of horses, glancing nervously at the ring of Comanche warriors who had come to meet them. The woman's eyes swept the camp until they landed on Sarah, her face lit with surprise and recognition. "My dear," she said, stepping forward, "you look so much like your mother. We are kin. I'm Margaret Whitfield, your aunt by marriage. We've come to bring you home." Sarah stood frozen, unsure if the warmth in her voice was genuine or rehearsed. The man beside her, tall and lean with a silver-headed cane, nodded curtly. "You'll be better off in the city, away from this," he said, his gaze flicking dismissively over the lodges and the people who watched in silence. That night, Sarah found herself sitting by the fire outside her lodge, turning their words over in her mind. The promise of a roof, food without worry, a bed without drafts. It was tempting. But each time she imagined it, the image felt distant, washed in a cold light. Chayton joined her quietly, lowering himself to sit beside her. She began to hum, the tune a song from her childhood, low and wistful. The words slipped out without her meaning to, carrying through the crisp air. He listened until the last note faded. "You sing of a place you miss," he said. She stared into the flames. "I'm not sure it exists anymore." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "Freedom is the greatest gift. You should take it, even if it means leaving this place." The weight of his words sank into her chest. She wanted to tell him freedom without him felt empty, but the fear of crossing worlds, of breaking under their weight, held her tongue. The next morning, she stood at the post outside her lodge, a small knife in hand. She carved the shape of a flower into the wood, each line careful, deliberate. "For you," she whispered, tracing the petals. When she returned inside, she found a scrap of tanned leather on her bedroll. The edges were smooth, and in the center, her name was carved in neat, sure strokes. "For home," his handwriting seemed to say without sound. By afternoon, her decision was made. The wagon was loaded, her few belongings stowed away. She stood before him in the fading light, the cold breeze lifting a strand of her hair. "I'm going," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded once, then go. But his eyes betrayed him. There was pain there, as sharp and clear as the wind. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the handkerchief she had carried since her arrival, the one she had tied to her valise that first night. She pressed it into his hand, closing his fingers around it. "Something to remember me," she said. The wagon driver called to her. She climbed aboard without looking back, afraid she might lose her resolve if she saw his face again. From the ridge at the edge of the camp, Chayton stood in the last gold of the setting sun, the handkerchief caught in his grip. The fabric fluttered in the wind, the faint blue embroidery catching the light. Sarah glanced back once, just before the bend in the trail hid the village from sight. He was still there, unmoving, the horizon stretching behind him like a painted canvas. She knew, with a hollow certainty, that she was carrying half of herself away. In his hand, the scarf was more than cloth. It was a promise, fragile but unbroken. The city greeted her with gas lamps and polished streets, the clatter of carriages echoing between rows of brick buildings. Margaret and her husband led her into a grand townhouse with a marble foyer and a chandelier heavy with crystal. Servants took her cloak, offering warm drinks and polite smiles. For a time, Sarah let herself be carried by the rhythm of this world, soft carpets underfoot, fires that never sputtered out, meals served on fine china. Yet at night, when the house fell silent, she lay awake beneath embroidered quilts and felt the weight of the walls pressing in. The air here was thick, unmoving, nothing like the sharp, clean wind that crossed the plains. She missed the sound of horses shifting in the night, the scent of wood smoke, the quiet strength of a man who kept watch outside her lodge. She missed the steady, unspoken bond that had taken root between them. One evening, as Margaret chattered about a winter ball, Sarah's hand slipped into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the smooth piece of tanned leather, her name faint beneath the ridges where Chayton's knife had carved it. She held it tight, and a thought took hold. This was not where she belonged. At dawn, she left. She traded her fine cloak for a sturdy riding coat at a livery, saddled a bay mare, and rode out before the city fully woke. The road back to the plains was long, the snow deep, but each mile felt like air filling her lungs again. 2 days into her journey, shadows emerged from the tree line. A half-dozen riders, their faces hidden beneath scarves, the glint of weapons catching the weak sunlight. Her pulse leapt. She recognized one of them from the attack on the village. They gave chase. She urged the mare into a gallop, snow kicking up in plumes behind them. The wind tore at her hair, but her mind was clear, drawing on what she had learned in the village. She veered toward a narrow pass between two ridges, letting the terrain break their formation. When the first rider closed in, she guided the horse toward a drift she knew would give way. The outlaw's mount plunged in, floundering, buying her precious seconds. Another drew alongside, reaching for her reins, but she ducked low, slashing at the air with the small blade Chayton had given her. The man cursed, falling back. By the time she emerged from the pass, the shouts behind her had faded. The mare slowed, sides heaving, steam rising from her flanks. Dusk settled in, the sky bruised with purples and blues. Through the gathering dark she saw it, a pinprick of orange against the endless white. A fire. His fire. In the village, Chayton sat cross-legged by the flames, the wind tossing sparks into the night. The days since her departure had been long and hollow. Each evening he lit the fire, telling himself it was for warmth, though deep down he knew it was something else. Beside him, the trunk of a cottonwood bore fresh marks, letters carved deep into the bark. Her name, for her return. The mare stumbled as they drew closer, her strength nearly spent. Sarah slid from the saddle, her legs unsteady. The leather scrap was still in her pocket, warm from her grip. "For my way back," she whispered into the cold, pressing it to her chest. Snow crunched under her boots as she pushed forward, the light growing brighter, steadier. Relief swelled in her chest, so strong it brought tears to her eyes. She took one last step, and the world tilted. She crumpled into the snow, the cold rushing up to meet her. But through the blur, she could still see it, the fire, his fire, steady and alive. Her heart leapt toward it, toward him. And then everything went dark. Snow crunched beneath his boots as Chayton rose from the fire. Something had shifted in the night air, a pull at the edge of his senses. His gaze swept across the white plain, and there she was. A dark shape against the snow, stumbling toward him before collapsing. He was running before thought could form, kneeling beside her in the drift. Her cheeks were pale, her lashes dusted with ice, but her chest rose and fell. "Sarah," he said, her name a quiet plea. Her eyelids fluttered, blue eyes finding his. Her lips moved, the words no louder than the wind. "My home is where you are." He gathered her into his arms, feeling the weight of her and the heat beneath her frozen coat. Without hesitation, he carried her toward the village, the firelight growing with each step. The people turned as he passed, whispers threading through the crowd, but no one stopped him. Inside his lodge, he settled her near the hearth, feeding the flames until they roared. He pressed a fur blanket around her shoulders. The scent of wood smoke filled the space, mingling with the steady rhythm of her breathing as it grew stronger. When she could stand again, she stepped outside with him. The villagers had gathered, their faces unreadable in the shifting firelight. Maka came forward, a small torch in hand. He spoke a few words in Comanche, then held the flame toward her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, its warmth seeping into her fingers. One by one, the villagers touched their torches to hers, the light growing until the whole circle glowed. It was the old ritual, sharing fire as a sign of acceptance. She met Chaitin's gaze across the flames and saw the faintest smile break the stern lines of his face. The next morning, they walked together to the cottonwood at the village's edge. Her name was already there, carved deep into the bark. With his knife, he carved his beside it. Their letters touched, entwined in the grain. Later, she knelt in the snow near her lodge, pressing the roots of wildflowers into the frozen earth. The petals would not open until spring, but she smiled at the thought. "For our home," she murmured. Chaitin stepped behind her, his shadow falling over the blooms. He wrapped his arms around her, his voice low at her ear. "You're my fire." They stayed like that for a moment, the world hushed around them, before he led her to the waiting horses. She swung up into the saddle, and he mounted beside her. Together they rode beyond the ridge, the wind lifting their hair, the sun melting into a horizon painted gold and crimson. The village faded behind them, but its hum lingered, voices, laughter, the slow crackle of the central fire. Above, the first stars began to pierce the deepening blue, the moon casting its glow over the plain. The horses' breath rose in white clouds, their hooves drumming a steady rhythm. Under the starlight and firelight, their love felt etched into the land itself, enduring, unshaken, as certain as the path beneath their feet. And though the world beyond might still hold its prejudice and storms, here, between them, there was only the truth they had chosen. Home was not a place, it was a person, and they had found it. And that, dear listener, is how a mail-order bride, left to die in the snow, found her way back, not just to safety, but to the only place that ever truly felt like home. In the windswept heart of Wyoming, 1876, Sarah and Chaitin built something stronger than the walls of any city mansion or the laws of any land, love that could weather both winter and the weight of two worlds. If this story stirred something in you, if you could almost hear the wolves beyond the ridge and feel the warmth of that shared fire, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of forbidden romance, untamed courage, and hearts that beat louder than the gunfire. Hit the bell so you never miss the next journey across the frontier, because out here, where bullets miss, hearts don't. End of account.